Welcome to Sunday Morning Bible Study with Pastor Zemke. This podcast is the weekly, digital way to be involved in the Prince of Peace Bible study. Whether you're at home, in the car, or wherever else you might be, we invite you to join us in studying God's Word. Today's lesson comes from Mark chapter 4.
Welcome back to the next in our series of podcasts. Today we're in Mark chapter 4 and 5. The section on parables, or section of parables, for now has ended, and Mark is back to telling the story of Jesus. And he's got a bigger chunk here, a little bit more than a chapter, and perhaps this is a time to say the chapter and versification is not native to the text. That is, somebody added it later to be helpful. If you remember being punished by reading William Shakespeare in high school, not that I think Shakespeare is bad, just that forcing high school kids to read it to each other is bad. You'll remember that there's those little numbers down the side that help you kind of know where you are, little lines, or if you have seen legal documents, they always start with a 10 up in the left corner and go down so you can see exactly what line you're in. Same idea here. That does not mean that the verses and numbers are blessed by God or right. And in fact, if it were up to me, I would move chapter 5 back to Mark 4:35 because we've stopped talking about what we're going to talk about and moved on. Why is chapter 5 where it is? I suspect because the Gerasene demoniac is actually quite the story. And it will take up most of the podcast today because once you get into verse 21, you have another Markan sandwich. And so I want to treat those kind of specially, and I don't want to tag it on to what will already be a longer podcast because of the content for today. So the content for today is the healing of a demon-possessed man and the calming of the storm. So there's a lot of meat actually in those two stories or those two accounts. So to tack on the rest is kind of a little bit of a thing. So if you were going for major stories, knowing that Mark 5 is the Gerasene demoniac is helpful. If you were doing this thematically, you would have moved the chapter marker to Mark 4, verse 35, and started it there because that's where the parables end. Likewise, again, if you were doing it thematically, you probably would move Mark 6 up and have a very short Mark 6 and start with the dead girl and the sick woman, and use that Markan sandwich, and then have a new chapter, right? There's no reason Mark has to have 16 chapters. So again, this is all just how you organize things and find things. And so this is me kind of being a little nitpicky, but also since this is a thematic and more of a literary conversation about the structure of Mark, I feel like we can probably have a few of those chats to kind of me being a little fussy about this. So before we get into these, the major theme of these three stories is, and actually Prophet Without Honor in chapter 6, is who do we think Jesus is? Who is Jesus and who is he to us? Now, Mark has told you right at the beginning who he is, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But some of this is the Son of God, and what does that mean? What's the rational entailment for that, and what kind of power does he have as the second person of the Trinity? And we've seen him heal and do miracles and exorcisms before, but these are kind of the miracles par excellence. This one is up there, right? This exorcism is the one exorcism everybody knows. Jesus calming the storm is actually one that most people know, or you could make allusion to, and the broader world would kind of get it. And that's not true for all of Jesus's miracles. I think it's only probably supplanted by the loaves and the fishes in terms of fame. So certain gospels have this feature of who do you say that I am, right? And it's probably best shown in Luke. Now, Luke, to have a very quick digression here, Luke is a biographical play, and it's meant to be put on as a play or as a Time Life Ken Burns sort of deal. And it's meant to have an intermission. And so the intermission where everybody gets up and goes and buys garum, which is a horrendous sauce made of decaying fish and salt that the Romans enjoyed, and you put it on your French fries or your salad or whatever else it is that you're eating, because they hadn't invented ranch. Come on, the best dipping sauce ever. So Mark does this, and has this, who do you say that I am? And it's sort of in the middle. It's in the middle third, toward the end of the first third, into the beginning of the second third, depending on how you divide it up. Luke's gospel has the same intermission in chapter 9, and there's a very pointed intermission in chapter 9 after Peter's confession of Christ, where Peter says, or where Jesus says, but who do you say that I am? And there's just kind of crickets in the text. And you're supposed to go up and get your hot dog and your beer or whatever else it is that you are getting, your garum. And then you're supposed to have those conversations in the minibar, and then you're supposed to go back and find your seats 20 minutes later, right? There are not really great cushions. Everybody's sitting outside. The actors needed time to rest their voice, same as today. So that's kind of where we're at here in Mark. You can go to Luke 9 and read. It's really a little more effective if you read all the way through from Luke 1 to Luke 9. But considering we're in Mark, if you have lots of time, go forth and do that. But if you don't, just know other gospels do this. This is kind of an intentional resting place. Or if the gospel's going to be done in full, then maybe we should have that chat about that. So without further ado, let's get into the text. So here's the first of our miracles. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took with him in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you no faith?" And they were filled with a great fear, and said to one another, "Who is this, then, that even the wind and the seas obey him?" So, the calming of the storm, a few technical points here. The Sea of Galilee is some 700-ish feet below sea level. And the hills around it and the surrounding mountains, because they hit mountain status, some of them are up to 10,000 feet. And so you have this hot sea air, this hot humid air coming up off the sea, and you've got this cold high wind coming down off the mountain. There are several big storms a year, probably mostly spring, summertime storms when those conditions would be just great. But then again, this is in the Mediterranean, and so that climate is a little bit more even. But they happen frequently enough. There's an Arabic word for these storms that translates as shark. And so when you see there in verse 37, a great windstorm, it might not have had rain, which is kind of fun. But the wind is truly ferocious. It's not a tornado, but we're hitting hurricane strength winds here out on the Sea of Galilee. So if you've ever wondered what kind of boat they were in, you can go and do a little Googling, because they actually found the Sea of Galilee kind of had a recession and kind of dried up a little bit, and they found a boat down in the mud, and they brought it back up, and this was about 1985, 86, somewhere around there, and it was kind of south of Capernaum by a little bit, but the boat happens to be 26 feet long and 7 feet wide and about 4 feet deep. So probably rode pretty low in the water with how much mass it had. Although you can go and look on that, and if any of you are sailors or nautical, you can come back and tell me how low it rode in the water. But it was decked as well. So it's not a rowboat kind of a thing. You probably, if you went to the same Sunday school as I did, maybe you have the good old Sunday school song, "Peter was rowing across the boat," or across the lake. Why is it always Peter? There are other apostles, right? it doesn't quite work as well if it's Thaddeus rowing across the lake, doot, 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 if you know the song. But so it's decked, which means that you're not sitting down in the bottom of the boat. That's Jonah, who's down below decks in the bottom. Here it's decked, and I think it's probably decked all the way across, just because nobody wants to sit in the bottom of the boat, and it gives you a little bit more stability. So Jesus is sleeping on a cushion in this great big storm. So those are the kind of the details. But when we say boat, this is not a little boat. It's a 26-foot long boat. And it's narrow, or narrower, as wooden boats generally will be. But it's not a little boat. And so Jesus is in the boat, and they think it probably could have held about 15, or that would have been a common number to have. Again, we're not sure if this is a pleasure craft or if this is a transportation ferry that we dug up, or if it's a fishing boat. But just know that the Sea of Galilee is big. If I remember, it's like 7 miles by 3 miles. It's really big. And so you get this, you need big boats for big bodies of water. So we have this kind of thing sitting here set up, so they're going to go across to the other end of the lake. Also, I'll say you'll notice that this one just blows right on into the Gerasene demoniac, which is why, again, I'm tempted to move verse 5 or chapter 5, the chapter marker, back to verse 35 of chapter 4, because this is all one giant story here. So the who do you say that I am? So the God who made the heavens and the earth, right? In the Greek and Roman world, every god has a sphere of influence. So Mars or Ares, depending on what nationality you are, is, or ethnicity, I suppose, is the god of war. And he can give you all kinds of help with war, but he's got nothing in terms of planting and agriculture. So in these, Mark's going to give you Jesus is the Son of God, and he's the God of everything. So the wind, all of creation, the wind and the seas and the storm and all of that, that is baked into this story, and the idea of Jesus is just God of everything, God of creation, is really important. And that's where he starts, partially because Peter and John Mark are Jews. And that's how the Jewish Bible starts. In the beginning, God created a heaven and the earth. So for them, God of creation means everything inside of creation. And then they'll move to spiritual powers, which are outside of creation in their minds, right? The principalities and the powers, as St. Paul calls them, those are not the same as nation states and the whole 9 yards, unless you're in Revelation, and that's a different thing. So Jesus gets up, they wake him up, and I like that Jesus is just sleeping because he's tired, and they're going to row across the lake because they know what they're doing. And so there's a subtle kind of hint from Jesus about you do what you're good at. There might have been a little, no, teacher, don't row the boat. We know what we're doing. We'll just row for you. But Jesus is content to let other people care for his earthly body, which is, there's something to be said for that. And I'll come back to that in a different podcast. But if you want to think about that, about in his humanity, Jesus trusts other people, it's something to consider and something to think on. But in any case, he's asleep. And they wake him up, and it's not, hey, there's a storm. It's, don't you care if we're going to die? So the boat is already taking on water, and it's not a great windstorm. We kind of talked about that. The Greek here is more like hurricane. That's kind of the idea. I don't know about the rain part. We kind of talked about this, but the waves are breaking into the boat, and the boat is filling. These are details that are left out of other gospels. So that, Mark is early, and Mark wants to add some details because he's the action comic, or he's the action version. And so we've got to actually include some of those details. So Jesus wakes up and says to awoke and rebuked the wind and the sea. So the word here, rebuke, is just the word rebuke. He kind of shouts into the wind. peace, be still. And notice here, there's a kind of there could be kind of a pun here. If you were already a Christian, the wind is also the word for Holy Spirit. And this is what the Spirit does for us. And so you could actually have some amount of kind of crossover here on this in terms of reading into this, and Jesus calms the storm and Jesus calms our heart. It's a more devotional sort of a way to read this, and I wouldn't say no to that. But know that that's kind of going on. So this is really unheard of, that somebody can just shout at the weather. And if you live where we live, I live outside of Portland, or in Battleground, Washington. There's a lot of rain. In fact, it was sunny yesterday afternoon, and now it's rainy again, which is great. It's raining all those pollen and allergens out of the sky. You go, rain, go for it. But there's a lot of shouting at the sky here, especially in late April, early May, when people just want the sun. And Pastor Dave just wants the rain. Come on, rain. Come on back. So no matter how much you shout at the weather, nothing happens. When Jesus shouts into the storm, everything goes quiet, which is what you expect if he's God. But since none of the disciples think he's God yet, they'll confess it, they'll think privately, but then when you see thinking something and then seeing something, those are two different things. That's why in St. John's epistle, 1 John, he says, that which we have seen with our own eyes, that we testify to you. John's big on, no, we saw this. And here in Mark, all the apostles see this, see Jesus do this miracle. And that leads to a giant, who do you think I am? Or here, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And you kind of get into the difference here, right? Because here in Mark 4, and we've just had Easter. This is Easter 4, if you're keeping track here of when these are being produced. Here, they're terrified. And Mark includes a infinitive construct, a Hebraism. In Greek, it literally says they feared a great fear, which is a Hebrew way to put things. So Peter and Mark are still leaving their Hebrew roots here on this, but they're terrified. And so instead of, I want to contrast this with Thomas's response, right? My Lord and my God. When he sees Jesus after the resurrection, that's his response. And Jesus kind of has a little bit of it's a blessing. It's not a chastisement, I don't think, as much as it's a blessing for everybody else, right? You believe because you have seen, but blessed are those who believe but haven't seen. There's a little bit of a rebuke in there, but it's more of a blessing. But there's a difference here, right? This does not inspire them to fall on their face and prostrate themselves and worship the Christ. No, this just makes them really weirded out and afraid, because you actually see God in his power. I'm also reminded here, if you go back and read Exodus, and Moses wants to see God, and God says, you can't see my front or it'll melt your face off. Think Indiana Jones there. So I'll pass by, and you can look at my back as I pass by, right? And there's a whole bunch of cataclysmic stuff, and then Moses sees the back of God as God passes by. And it's this life-changing and literally earth-shattering sort of deal. Here, they've seen Jesus as God. And this for them is absolutely terrifying, and not just because they see somebody with power over the weather like he's some sort of great magician, but because the apostles are Jews. They're good, pious Jews, or maybe not so pious Jews. They're at least cultural Jews, and so they know exactly who he is and exactly what this means, that the Son of God is here, and that somehow, because it hasn't been fully explained to them, so maybe they don't know exactly what it means, but they know somehow Yahweh is with us. And that's a really big, really interesting, but also really terrifying sort of deal. I'll kind of close out the section with a story here to give a sense of this. Everybody has supernatural stories, or lots of people have supernatural stories, and they're usually like really heartfelt and wonderful, and isn't this nice? A few of them are near-death experiences about going to the red hot light, and those aren't so nice. Yeah, but I've only heard the ones who then later converted. So I've never heard I was headed to the red hot light and I don't care. But at the end of all this, so I am one of a set of triplets. I had never actually been in like a room or an apartment alone because there's always my brother or my family or my roommates in college. And so I'm in college, and my wife at this point, I think she was just my girlfriend. I don't think I'd proposed yet. But we're hanging out, and she goes home, and I mentioned to her that I'm kind of, weirded out about being in the apartment alone. My roommate was off for Christmas vacation at this point, and I was staying on campus to work. And so my wife ends up, we pray, and she prays that God would send an angel to protect me. And I think, oh, isn't this nice? So I lead her out of the apartment and see her off. And then I come back in, and there's a presence in the living room, not one that I can see, but one that I can feel. And the living room is absolutely terrifying because it's holy. And I think what happened is God did send that angel to protect me. And there was a giant sense of holiness there in the room. And it was alien and other. And even though I'm a Christian, and even though I'm baptized, and even though I have, the righteousness of Christ through my baptism, there's the righteousness of Christ. And then there's finding something that's completely and totally holy and righteous, and that's not me. And by the way, that's not you either. And so it wasn't, seeing this little kind of cartoony angel, or for the love, the horrendous precious moments, children angels. It's just no. This was terrifying, and so I went back in my room, and thank God for that, but shut the door firmly and didn't go out until the morning. That kind of holiness and otherness is, I think, what we're talking about here. And when the apostles see it, they are terrified because they see God in his power working. And so that's kind of this other level of terror that you can sometimes get when you actually experience the spiritual, right? Paul always talks about it being wonderful, and I had it caught up in a great cloud vision and to the seventh heaven, and whatever that means. But sometimes when you actually experience the holiness of God and his power, it's just flat out terrifying. So we'll move on to something that also could be terrifying depending on how many exorcism movies you've seen. All right, so we're now into chapter 5 proper, even though we've already been in chapter 5. If you take Pastor Dave's renumbering, it's not perfect, but it's better than what we got. And I think that because it's my numbering. So there it is. So the Gerasene demoniac actually is a short little exorcism, but then what happens afterward is not short. And so we end up with this kind of thing where I end up having to break it up. Just one, because the text won't fit all in one slide, and two, because we need to look at those parts kind of separately. So here's the text. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain, for he had been bound often with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day amongst the tombs, and on the mountains he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of this man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Okay, so this actually falls along with most of the other demon exorcisms that we've got in the gospel, except here we get this longer story, and here we get not just one demon, but many. So they're rowing across the sea. Now, the east bank of the Sea of Galilee is Jewish Judean territory. The west bank of the Sea of Galilee is not. The west bank is Roman territory. So if you're already thinking about the pigs, which is always something fun that people just get super excited about, hooray, good for you. But if you've ever wondered, what are good Jews doing with pigs? Partially, it's not a Jewish part of the area. They're on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. The other thing is, the other reason there are pigs there is, hey man, a job's a job. And so, raising pigs don't mean you got to eat them. And so there's kind of a little bit of that. We'll find some less pious people who want a job, right? And I suspect when in the parable of the prodigal son, when he's looking down at the pigs and seeing the pods the pigs are eating, I suspect that the prodigal son is in the parable. Everybody reads it and understands he's gone to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, out of Judea, and he's off over there. There is no prodigal son, so if I'm wrong about this, then that's fine. But I think in people's minds, they're thinking, oh, he just went across the sea. And of course, across the sea, those people over on the other side of the ocean, they're crazy, right? I mean, they drink tea and drive on the wrong side of the road and don't have a president. They have a prime minister. And what's with their flag with no stars on it? Just like 3 different crosses. Okay, Brits. I'm an Anglophile. I like the Brits. I'll stop beating up on them, right? But that kind of association. So Jesus is rowing across the lake. Why? To get to the other side, which is not Jewish. And so this is an expansion of his ministry. They're going to do some ministry over here, or at least that's the hope. And they've kind of, punted across the sea. Probably not punting, but you know what I mean. So the country of the Gerasenes, they're across on the other side. They get out of the boat and they're met immediately by a man with an unclean spirit. And so this takes a fraction of a second. Now you get all this filling in information that Mark gives you to set the scene, which makes it feel longer. But what happens is the guy sees them rowing across the lake, and the demon knows who this is, right? I don't know what it's like to be a demon, but I assume there's like a giant exclamation point over the boat or something, or maybe he can just see the holiness of the Christ in the boat coming toward him, right? And so he comes down from the hills and starts running toward the boat, and this is not what the demon wants. This is what the demon has to do because God is there. God is present. And it's very much against the nature of the demons to do this. But when God shows up, everything bows down to worship him, whether it wants to or not. And I think this is a really important point to make here, right? We kind of sing, if you remember, the trees of the field will clap their hands, right? And we got this great idea here, but no, everything. When God comes, everything bows down before him. Every tongue confesses that Jesus Christ is the Lord, right? And for the demons, it's not salvific because it doesn't save them, because they don't want him to be. And in their heart of hearts, they're muttering, but I could have done a better job. Or I would have showed those humans what's what. Or I would have toasted Adam and Eve and just left it in just kind of a dark void of us and them. And but the demon sees him and is running down. And so if we kind of take everything out of here, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, crying out with a loud voice, saying, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Don't torment me." And Jesus at the same time is saying to him, "Come out of him, you unclean spirit." So this is a really hot and fast sort of deal, and it's broken up by the text. And to some extent, you kind of got to set it up literarily, and how else are you going to do this? But it brings up a fun little Greek note here for what I think is going on is, if not grammatically, then definitely thematically, we have what's called attendant circumstance. So this is actually when we're using the words to say these two things are happening at the same time. So while the demon is crying out, "What do you want with me?" Jesus is saying or shouting, "Come out of you, you unclean spirit," or "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Those two things are happening simultaneously. Everybody's talking at once, and it's really loud. And so this is not a you talk, then I talk situation. Jesus just sort of gets out of the boat, looks at him, and starts this babbling guy and commands the demon. I bring this up because another attendant circumstance is in Matthew's gospel at the end, in the Great Commission, when Jesus says, "Go baptizing and teaching." We don't break those up. Those are done at the exact same time. That baptism is a teaching moment, and that we do all of it together. It's not meant to be pulled apart. And especially, other sort of denominations will have other kind of takes on this about when you get baptized and who needs to be baptized and how often you should be baptized. But for us, it's just all in one go, because that's actually what the Greek says. This is all in one go. When you believe in Jesus, you need to be baptized. We might, for adult converts, say, yeah, we should probably make sure you really do believe in Jesus and know what you're getting yourself into, instead of having this moment of faith and a conversion and going to be baptized. So we might have some adult Bible class sort of stuff, and other denominations will as well. But other denominations will, kind of pull out the stops of, well, you can't believe until you're 8 or 9, or you can't believe unless you're in your right mind, or if you're not mentally ill, or unless you verbally confess Christ as Lord, a bunch of other things. But I bring up the attendant circumstance thing because it's actually a feature, and it's what's going on here, and it happens a few other times in the Bible, so I'm just going to bring that up here. So we do get some details about this particular demoniac that they've tried to deal with him in the past, and he really is demon possessed, and they've used shackles and chains. A quick word about metallurgy: these are not hardened steel handcuffs. These are whatever they've got, and those links that they have are not forge welded together or spot welded as handcuff links are today. No, these are just your classic kind of wrought iron chains. And so, yes, there's demonic power there, but no, these are not sort of hardened steel, what some people might be thinking of. Although the word shackle should really kind of key you into this as to what's going on here. So he's off in the boonies, up in the hills, crying out and cutting himself with stones. And so he hasn't been allowed to torment anybody down in town or just be crazy. They've kicked him out and he's not there. And so he's just going to kind of use his human legion, are just going to kind of use their human to abuse himself and be kind of horrendous and be out there. Noise carries just surprisingly well. And so you're going to bed and you hear Legion out there doing his thing. And it's a bit unsettling. So when we get into the rest of the podcast and the rest of the time here, as we talk about this kind of stuff or the rest of the story, just know that Legion is out there. And this is actually a real help to the community that he has been taking care of. So the demon thinks that Jesus is about to torture him. The demon is not really keyed into what's actually going to happen on the last day, right? It's not an intentional messing around. That's what the demon would do. So there's a little bit of insight there in terms of what's the demon want to do? Torture. What's the Son of God want to do? Just expel and release the person. So I don't think that should surprise really anybody that the demons want to torture. That's kind of their thing. That shouldn't surprise people, but here we are in the midst of this. What should also be chilling, though, is in the midst of this demon exorcism, it's not just one, right? There's a pack of them. And one of them speaks and says their name is Legion, and there's many. There's just lots of them. And so that part is actually really, really disturbing, that it's not just one, that it's a full-out possession, and there's lots of them in there. And Jesus just casts them out with a word. And so this part here of the text, you can't see, but I've got my arm up kind of waving at my screen here as I'm looking at it. This part here is just a really quick and fast happening exorcism that happens as they get out of the boat. And so this is just a great way to kick off our time in the Gerasenes and our ministry here is with an exorcism. You'll notice there's not really here much discussion from the disciples or any of that kind of stuff. I think they're used to exorcisms by now. I think they're used to Jesus healing people. So there's not going to be a whole lot of commentary here from them, because this is kind of standard operating procedure for Jesus. Go into a place and to bind up all the spirits. But in terms of the who do you say that I am, now coming just directly from Jesus calming the storm and terrifying the pants off of the apostles by having power over the storm, he has power over not just one demon, but all demons and really bad possession kinds of demons. And he just away with you, right? That kind of just get out of here sort of power. And you don't see that anywhere else. And so Mark is lining these up and marshaling all of his rhetorical or literary skills here to make the point. The Son of God that I talked about in my chapter 1, verse 1, this is what he's able to do. Not just regular old healings and Peter's mom and, just random people who are demon possessed, but people who are really, really the worst part of demon possessed, and he's able to take care of them. So we'll move on to the next part, which I always enjoy, and which happens to be the bit with, I think, the pigs. So here's the bit with the pigs, which I love because I like pigs, and pork is delicious. Now there was a great herd of pigs that was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us into the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs and the herd, numbering about 2,000. They rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Super. So what a great loss of pork, although I'm pretty sure they just fished out the pigs. Don't let food go to waste. But they weren't market weight, and we were doing our thing, and now we got all this extra work. I'll stop sounding like a swineherd there for a minute. So what's going on here? This is kind of an interesting take here for Jesus of, go into the pigs. Now, this makes sense if you have a view of Jesus as fulfilling all of the law and all of the prophecies. And so there's a bit here with the law that says, I'm going to give you all the land, right? And you can go back and read Exodus or Deuteronomy or Joshua and Judges and find out the borders of the land. But it's basically from Edom/Egypt down in the south up until you get to Turkey, and from the Mediterranean all the way over until you get to the Tigris and Euphrates where they meet. I know I'm overgeneralizing, but it's an enormous chunk. It's a huge, huge chunk that they're going to get given. And they never take that much land. And you can go back in the back of your study Bible, or you can Google how much land did the Israelites actually hold under Solomon at the height of Solomon's power, which is kind of where Jesus is. So you can go see. But part of it is Jesus is Israel brought down to one. But he's also, so there's things that Israel needs to do that they never do. Of course, as Jesus walks around and fulfills the law and fulfills all righteousness, he picks up where they miss out. Jesus goes down to Egypt. And so he kind of follows the story of Israel as well, right? Their life and times. He goes down to Egypt, he comes back out. He does it sinlessly, he does it quickly, but he does go to Egypt. On a side note, on a missional kind of a note, if you're ever talking to sub-Saharan Africans who are Muslims, and there's a lot of them, and in fact, we're kind of at a tipping point in Africa where there's a decent chance that Christianity will be absolutely erased in many African countries because the Muslim majority is just kind of insatiable and unstoppable. And these are ancient Christian communities that have been there for thousands, 1,500, 2,000 years, about to be wiped out. So it's something to pay attention to, and to raise your voice in protest over the slaughter of these Christians. But if you're talking to one of these Muslims from sub-Saharan Africa, or really any part of Africa, there's a lot of pride there that they're African Muslims, that they're not Arab Muslims, and that Islam can be other places. But you can ask them, did Muhammad ever go down to Egypt? Or did Muhammad ever come to Africa? Because Jesus did. And that's a really profound missional move. To talk about that with them, about the God who came to their continent because he loves everybody and he loves Africans. So if you're ever in that position and you're talking, you can bring up that Isa, which is the Arabic version of Jesus. Isa did come to Africa, and what did they think about that? But as Jesus comes back, he's there too to purify the land. And there is a little sense, I think a little of what's going on here is a little tiny piece of the conquest, right? We see a spiritual conquest and we're totally fine with that, right? Jesus just wandering around casting out demons and purifying the land from hellspawn, and that's fine. You can tell I've played too many video games and too many board games, now referring to them as Hellspawn, but it's true, right? So you get that. That's all fine. Nobody's got problems with that until we get to this. And I think the purification of the land that Jesus is doing, right, and then the other spiritual purification, right, circumcising everybody's hearts and creating good faith in them and right belief in them, we're totally cool with that too. Then we get to real purification of the land when Jews are not to be keeping pigs, and this West Bank area is supposed to have been Israel, and had been at other times, and Jesus purifies the land. And we've got this sense here where it is kind of why are you doing this? What are you doing? This isn't nice, and kind of too bad. If that weirds you out too much, go and read Isaiah 63. Because the picture from the Old Testament, there are two pictures in the Old Testament of the last day, and one picture from the Old Testament of the last day really is this picture of the wedding feast of the Lamb. Okay, there's more than two pictures. There's 3 or 4. I lied. Or misspoke, whatever. So one of them is the marriage feast of the Lamb. One of them is kind of this cataclysmic end before the beginning sort of picture, especially out of Amos. But another is just this strong picture of cleansing the land. So go back and read Isaiah 63, or sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, because that's just as much about Jesus marching in and trampling down the grapes of wrath against the people, or the demons and the principalities and all those that stand against him in the gospel, as much as it is the end times. So he does it in different ways, and I know Battle Hymn of the Republic is probably aimed a little bit more at fundamentalist Christianity and a little bit more at earthly peril and especially Revelation, but There's a theme there throughout Isaiah, especially, where God's going to come and cleanse the land. And here's Jesus, and he's come in power, and the demons get that. And so it shouldn't really be surprising that Jesus is going to get a twofer, that the demons will get one last little bit of mischief before they actually have to depart. So we get this, what I think is going on inside of this. We get now who can do that? And he doesn't just exorcise demons, right? We could totally see if Jesus were some kind of magician or shaman and he had a ritual practice for exorcising people. And so, you bang the gongs and you light the incense and you wave the sage around and, you do the things. We get that. But Jesus has conversations with the spiritual powers and then he commands them and they have to go. Who does that? The Son of God. And it's not just mischief here, right? This whole, 2,000 pigs running down the hill. I kind of want to see stampeding pigs. Kind of awesome. I also want to be about 500 yards away from them. We've got this, but I think there is a cleansing of the land thing that's going on here. And of course, at the end, they're rowing across the lake because they want to get over to do some missionary work, some ministry work over here. And what happens? Well, the townsfolk come out to see a bunch of pigs, trotters up in the lake, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. This is probably an imperfect verb here for to beg. Imperfect would mean past tense, kind of, but the idea here is there's some extra stuff on the front of it. I think began is probably not a great way to translate this. It probably should be, and they insistently begged Jesus to depart from their region. They want him gone. Not just because he kind of creeps them out, because who does this, but I think they also want him gone simply because they're worried about Roman retaliation, right? They're on a contract job. The Romans have said, you will farm pigs and you will have this job and we're going to do this here. And now all the pigs are dead. And when the Romans come back, they're going to be unhappy, understandably so. And I think they just don't want the retaliation. I think they want this was Jesus. You go talk to him. As soon as we found here, we got rid of him. We're good citizens. Hail Caesar, the whole 9 yards. So, to some sense, this story is put in here as a who do you say that I am story. And again, as the exorcism everybody thinks about when we say that Jesus has power over the demons. But it's also put in here as again with, the people who are demon possessed or who have leprosy, and then Jesus tells them to be silent and then they don't, and it kind of ruins it, and he can't do much ministry because he's just getting mobbed. This is sort of, kind of standard operating procedure for Jesus. He goes places, he does things, and then he gets kicked out, either because the crowds are too great and he can't handle that much attention, or they want nothing to do with him. Now, if you're a fan of John's gospel, John records this in a different way, that Jesus routinely, through the teaching sections of John's gospel, Jesus routinely builds up a following, then has some hard parables that kind of frustrate the new followers, and they leave Jesus, and the apostles from time to time get on Jesus and say, hey man, this isn't church growth. We had these people, and if you would have just milked them along a little bit more, we could have had, a bigger thing here. And Jesus is having none of it. And Jesus is just kind of has the people who want me are going to stay, and the people who don't can go. And it's not my place to build up the church right now or to gain a following. That's not what we're here for. So John's got a little different take on this, but in Mark's gospel, Jesus is constantly being run out of town, either pushed out of town unintentionally from adoring fans or asked to leave as he is here. And so he's going to be a good guest And he's going to get back in the boat in the next slide or the next little piece that I'll talk about. So that's fine. But just know it's not always just one success to another, and just building up the kingdom, as it were, in terms of church growth and church membership. And look, now we got 200 people, and now we got 300, and oh my goodness, now we got a second service, right? Jesus doesn't care about numbers. He cares about hearts. And it's a really important thing to kind of zero in on. And if he sees your heart is hard, one of two things happens. Either he leaves, as he does here, right? I mean, they're not going to be receptive. It's just going to be an uphill slog. Or you get the bull, right? And you get the horns. And you see that with the Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the priest. And again, if you want really good examples, go and read Luke's gospel. And maybe I'll do a Luke podcast after this one, and we can talk about what I think is going on in Luke. But you get a lot more abrasive Jesus in Luke's gospel. So we'll move on then to the end of this story and get kind of a little bit more of a plaintive ending here to this entire episode. So here's the last part of the story. Now, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him, and he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. So I said this was kind of a plaintive sort of ending because the language here, be with him, means I want to join up. I want to be one of your apostles. And you could totally have me. It'd be great. And, I know I've got some skills, and I'm a really hard worker, and I don't do drugs, and I don't stay up late, not anymore, right? All those things are going on, and Jesus says no. So commentators are kind of split in terms of why this poor guy doesn't get to join up, because that's really what he's asking here. Be with him. That language is back from Mark chapter 3 with the calling of the apostles. And this guy's a joiner, right? And so it's kind of split into two groups. One group thinks that Jesus doesn't allow him to join because Jesus' mission and ministry is primarily in Judea. It's primarily, and it's essentially at the end going to be in Jerusalem. And if he's got this random Gentile, and so this is part of the assumption, he could have been a non-pious Jew living over there. He could have been a formerly pious Jew living over there. But the assumption is maybe he's a Gentile and Jesus doesn't want Gentile baggage. The ministry will just be easier if he's an all-Jewish ministry to start off. And you'll notice that all the guys who are initially apostles are Jews. All the women who are involved in the ministry are Jews. There's something to be said for that. When you start your church, one way to start it is to just do the like-minded individuals. And whoever's here. Another way is to do it with, we live really close, so we're going to go over here. And frequently with new denominational plants, it's more of a geographic thing than anything else, right? Prince of Peace in Battleground, it's not actually that far in terms of mileage to any of the other LCMS churches that are down south in Vancouver, with the exception of there's not a good way to get there from here. So it just feels like a long drive to Good Shepherd or to Memorial or to St. John's because there's not a good way to get there. So let's put a church out here in Battleground. It'd be great. It'll be wonderful. So that's one way to do it. Like-minded individuals is more of a, we're putting Lutheran churches in and we're looking for Lutherans, and specifically liturgically minded Lutherans. That's actually what's going on today. So most of the new church plants inside of the LCMS are pushing on more liturgical, hyper-liturgical Lutherans. With the exception of the Great Northwest District that's just trying to get anything to get people to meet Jesus. So I won't go down that path much further than that. Another way to plant churches, and these are different is lifestyle churches. So you'll see the cowboy churches out here. That's not what I'm into, but if that's you, great, go all the time. But what's really common, and I haven't seen one in Battleground, maybe you guys know where it is, or in Vancouver, but recovery churches. And so everybody who goes to this church is a drug addict. We're all clean, we're all sober, we're all off, but that's what holds us together is our sobriety and Jesus' help and victory over our and it's wonderful. I'm not knocking them. It's fantastic. And it's just easier. So if you've got a church of addicts and Mr. Clean and Sober and teetotaler and straight-laced comes over, not really going to be welcome. I mean, you'd like them to be welcome, and church is church and everybody wants to grow, but that's not really what we do here, right? So to some extent, I could see that argument if he, in fact, is a Gentile. He doesn't have to be a Gentile. And this idea that, yes, there are national borders, but everything's being run by the Romans, and the Israelites have lived in the land for 1,400 years. So there's a decent chance this guy could be Jewish, or one of the Israelites, and maybe he's pious, maybe he wasn't. Who knows? So that's one argument in terms of why Jesus doesn't, is maybe he just wouldn't fit, or it'd be too hard for his ministry. You'll notice the church, and St. Paul does this in the circumcision debate. Timothy gets circumcised. Why? Because he's super young. And it's going to make his life and ministry easier, and he won't have to put up with that. Titus, however, doesn't get circumcised. Why? Well, one, because he's old, and there's some biological reasons why that would just not be nice. And two, not that it was nice for Timothy, by the way, but two, Paul wants to lean on people. And Titus doesn't have a whole lot of ministry left, but Titus is an older gentleman, and I get the sense that he could take care of himself in an argument. And he can put up with it. And he won't have the rest, he will have the rest of his life, but he won't have decades to put up with this "why aren't you circumcised" thing, the way Timothy will. So I get it. That could be something. But we do this from time to time to say, let's do this ministry, and let's do this ministry over here, and let's get all this one type of people, whatever type we're going for, and see if we can spark something over here. So it's not weird for us. The other option is that Jesus wants to leave this guy as one of his disciples over in the Gerasenes, that you're going to be fine. You've had this life-changing experience with me. You've seen the actual God in flesh, Jesus. You've seen me. You know who I am. Your one story will be sufficient to prime the hearts and minds of the people until the gospel and the church get rolling. So it could be just you can't come with me, but I'm going to leave you here to do the same work that you'd be doing over here. You're just like the first of my satellites. He does not get apostleship. And so that's important to point out. He is a disciple. He is a follower of Jesus with one really, really good story. And that's a story that sells. That's a story that he can bank on because everybody knows him. Hey, that's Legion. Or that's the guy who had Legion in him. So that's the other option. But there is, at the end of this whole thing, I still feel this plaintive, come on, Jesus, let him come with you. And I feel this mostly because this is all of our prayer. This is what we want. As soon as we see Jesus, it's sort of I want to be with you all the time. And to some people, Jesus says no. And there's got to be a great reason. So you can write it down. You can ask Jesus when he comes back, hey, what about that guy with the Gerasenes? Is he in heaven? Why didn't you let him come with you? But I feel, again, a little let down, and that's fine. Jesus is not sinning here, but from a human perspective and a real literary kind of reading of this, I feel kind of sad that this poor guy just wants to be with Jesus. And we see other people get to come and be with Jesus for a short time, this whole thing probably 20 minutes, maybe 40. 40 life-changing minutes. The lady at the well, the woman at the well, that's probably like a 15-minute thing. And then there's the stuff from the town, right? The people. So you don't always get the salvation in the gospel pre-crucifixion, pre-resurrection. Salvation in the gospel looks like this, but it's not always satisfying. And we don't always get the full story. Now, one other thing that is running along here that I think we could talk about is that Mark leaves details. He names names, and all of the Paul does this, all of the New Testament writers do this, and they make mention of people. And we kind of flip through our concordance and our things and look for people, and we just can't find any reference to this. And it's because these people were alive when the authors were writing. And so they have no problem saying, oh yeah, it was so-and-so and so-and-so. And everybody in the early church says, oh, cool. We knew them. There's their backstory right there. These are left in as ancient church, first edition marks of authenticity. So one of the reasons that this is in here, the Gerasene demoniac, is, it serves the literary purpose of bolstering this question. Who do you say that I am? Well, the one who has power over creation, and now the one who has power over the spirits. And the one from our previous discussion, or my previous monologue, about the one who can cleanse Israel. That's baked in. I think that's part of this. But I think that this is also in here because this guy was in the church, and the church knew him, and he was somebody that they could, meet and hang out. He's not named because I think everybody just kind of knows who he is. And I think there's sort of a sense of humility that runs along here too, of, hey, we're putting this gospel together. Do you want to have a name? Do you want to be in here? Yeah, sure, you can tell my story, but leave my name out of it. Nobody needs to know who I am. They need to know Jesus. And so when you read the Gospels, lots of times it's important who gets a name and who doesn't get a name. And sometimes you get a name because you're famous and everybody needs to know who you are, like the apostles and the disciples and the women who are there. Sometimes you get a name because of your notoriety. Specifically, or so we can for all eternity revile you, right? Annas and Caiaphas, holy cow. These poor guys, 2,000 years of disdain and hatred to these two guys. And maybe it's deserved, maybe it's not. Pontius Pilate, from the creed, right? There's that mark of authenticity. We know Pontius Pilate was a real guy. We found his seat. We found record of him. But also, there is a sense of we know your name. We know your name, and we're going to say your name, and we're going to spit after it for the next 2,000 years, and you will be reviled. So there's all kinds of things. Who gets a name and who doesn't get a name is another really important interpretive move. But here again, as we kind of leave this section of Mark and this story, section here, it does kind of end on a plaintive note, and I'm okay with that, because faith in Christ looks different in every single person, and what I want is not necessarily what God wants, and not every story has an instantly happy ending. And it's important to point that out, lest we get into this sort of sense where, well, it always has to be this way. So we're going to wrap it up here. I think this has gone on long enough. And so we'll meet you back here next time as we gather in for a sick girl or a dead girl and a sick woman and the Markan sandwich, and kind of finish off that whole big group. We can talk about all the things that the sandwich entails. So until next time, have a great day in the Lord, God's blessings, and peace be with you.